Good morning, Messiah. Good morning. So as you know that Pastor and Melissa are down in Mexico. They're having a nice time. So today for Bible class, we are going to begin a video on WELS history. As many of you know and already heard, our church body, the WELS, is celebrating its 175th anniversary this year. This presentation was given this past summer at the Synod Convention that was held at Martin Luther College. Presenting is Professor Joel Otto of Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary. The professor teaches church history to our seminary students and co-authored the hardcover book, Christ Through Us, which some of you may already have ordered and received. So enjoy the video and learn more about God's goodness to our church body across these last 175 years. We will make note of where we pause the video. We won't go through it all this morning, and Pastor will share the link so you can continue watching it from home if you like.
It is a humble privilege to be able to serve as the convention essayist today for this 175th, as we celebrate the 175th anniversary of our synod. 50 years ago, at the 125th anniversary convention, one of the essayists was my grandfather, Armin Schutze. And as be typical WELS thing, you already heard from one other grandson of Armin Schutze. The preacher yesterday, Pastor Mark Gabb, is my cousin, in which case a lot of you are probably saying, well, of course he is. Why celebrate 175th? Oh, I should also maybe make one other mention. I'm not going to read my essay to you. It is available in your packet of information. You can read, I know that. I'm going to present it using a lot of pictures. The content will be there. If you want to follow along in the essay, you're more than welcome to. If you want to nitpick my grammar afterwards, I'll be here till the end of the convention. Otherwise, I'm going to present it more in photos and present the content to you today. Why celebrate 175 years? Doesn't have 2 zeros in it. Doesn't even have 1. Doesn't have a catchy Latin title like centennial or bicentennial. In fact, Wikipedia isn't even quite sure what to do with it. Personally, I like the last one. I'm not going to try to pronounce it. But I think that's a serious question to consider. Why celebrate a 175-year anniversary, especially in our American society where there just doesn't seem to be a real interest always in history. In fact, I think there's a disinterest and sometimes disdain for history because, frankly, everybody can find all the information they need on a quick Google search. And a lot of people, I think, have this idea that what can the past teach us about the present and the future? And maybe that's especially prevalent among some of the younger generations. I think that's precisely why we should celebrate a 175th anniversary. Because it is something unique. Now, in the grand scheme of, or context of Christianity, 175 years, not even 1/10. 500 years of Reformation history, a little over 1/3. But in the context of American Lutheranism, 175 years becomes rather significant. Yes, there were church bodies that were started as early as 1748, but only the Missouri Synod, which was started in 1847, can still retain and connect its identity for as long as the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod can. All those other older Lutheran church bodies that were started prior to the Missouri and Wisconsin synods have kind of lost their identity. They've all been swallowed up in merger after merger that culminated in the 1988 merger of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. They've all kind of lost that identity and certainly lost their theological moorings. So that makes the celebration of our 110th anniversary, or 175th anniversary, something significant and special and unique. And I think looking at church history is valuable because finally, church history is God's saving activity in the world and in the church for the church. It's interesting how the Psalms use history in various ways. Psalm 105 talks about how God keeps his promises, kept his promises down through the ages to Abraham and his descendants. He remembers his covenant forever, the promise he made for 1,000 generations. Psalm 106 uses history to call us to repentance. First of all, we have sinned, even as our ancestors did. We've done wrong and acted wickedly. And then it catalogs sins of Israel's past, but then points to God's mercy to lead God's people to pray, "Save us, Lord our God, and gather us from the nations that we may give thanks to your holy name and glory in your praise." Psalm 44 reminds us that all the victories that God has won, yes, he has used us, but finally he's the one who wins the victories. And that's something that we should remember as we look at history. Psalm 78 reminds us we shouldn't keep this history to ourselves. We should, as the last verse there says, tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power and the wonders he has done. And then the psalmist spends over 60 verses recounting episodes of Israel's history from the Exodus all the way to the reign of King David. Psalm 107 starts with the rescue at the Red Sea, goes through the journey to the promised land, so that God's people might simply give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. There are applications for us as we celebrate our anniversary. First of all, looking at our synod's history can help us remember that God is faithful to his promise that the gospel will be preached until he returns. And by his grace, he uses us to do that. We recognize that the WELS is not the church triumphant. And so looking at our history can help us to have a spirit of repentance. Certainly trust in God's promise of mercy and forgiveness for the strength to keep moving forward. We can grow in our appreciation that, yes, God uses flawed jars of clay, as President Schrader said earlier today, but that he has won the victories, and we can rejoice in those victories that we can see in our history. This is the first anniversary in this millennium. There's a whole new generation of WELS members who maybe don't know that much about our synod's history. Here's an opportunity to teach them about God's surprising grace for 175 years. And then finally, it's a time to give thanks for God's mercy and his grace to us. And maybe you're catching a theme there, to focus on God's grace. 50 years ago, when WELS celebrated its 125th anniversary, that was simply the theme, Grace 125. And Kurt Eggert wrote his hymn, Not Unto Us, for that anniversary. And I would just like to have us sing and focus on just briefly 2 stanzas of that hymn. the more I've studied, researched, written, presented, and taught on our synod's history, the more amazed I am at God's surprising grace to our synod. There are numerous times where things could have gone sideways, and we would be a completely different synod if we would even still exist. By His amazing grace, the message of His amazing grace in Christ has been at the heart of what WELS has been all about, what we continue to be all about. His faithful love has shepherded congregations, called workers, members, our synod, through times, sometimes of our faithlessness and challenging times in our world and in the church. His forgiving love has led us to the truth, often, and sometimes it's been a journey to find that truth. And His unyielding love has allowed us to stand firm on the truth of God's Word, even in the face of a society that rejects that truth. And by His grace, He has blessed our feeble efforts so that we have been that we have been sent forth to speak pardon and peace. So in our time together today, I hope that this review and reflection on our synod's history will teach us to sing glory and praise. The beginnings of our synod, this church body originally known as the German Evangelical Synod of Wisconsin, it's somewhat a miracle of God's surprising grace that it got off the ground and survived those early years. December 8th, 1849, several men met at Grace downtown Milwaukee. They had one thing in common. They all came from the same mission house, the Barmen Mission House, and were sent by the Langenberg Mission Society. Wilhelm Reda, serving in Salem, Granville, northwest of Milwaukee, and a few other groups nearby. Johann Weinmann was serving in St. John's Oak Creek and a few other churches heading down toward Racine. Both of them had arrived in 1846 in the United States and they came to Wisconsin in 1848. Johannes Mühlhäuser was actually the first missionary sent by Langenberg to America. He spent a decade in upstate New York, and then at the urging of Reda and Weinmann, he came to Milwaukee, started Grace Church early 1849, and was kind of the leader of this group. And then there was a fourth guy, Paul Meiss. He was actually a Barmen dropout, paid his way to America, was passing himself off as a pastor and serving some groups near Schleisingerville. Modern day, today it's Slinger, Wisconsin. Why start a new church body in the Milwaukee area? There were already congregations of old Lutherans, as President Schrader mentioned. Buffalo Synod had a church, the oldest church in Wisconsin, oldest Lutheran church in Wisconsin, Trinity in Freistadt, today Mequon. Missouri Synod had its Trinity in downtown Milwaukee, a neighbor of Grace. But those early founders, coming from those mission societies where there wasn't such a distinction between Lutheran and Reformed, they didn't have a real great appreciation and maybe even a great knowledge of the Lutheran confessions or understand their implications. They were suspicious of those old Lutherans. They didn't like the strictness, the exclusivity that seemed to come from those old Lutherans. So they wanted a milder Lutheranism. And so, on Trinity Sunday, May 26, 1850, they gathered at Salem. They were joined by a couple of other men. Caspar Ployce was serving some groups up near Sheboygan. And there was a man named Jacob Conrad who was selling religious literature but wanted to be a pastor. They elected Mühlhäuser as the president. They approved the Constitution. They assigned Conrad to Reda to get more training, and the Wisconsin Synod was born. A decade later, only two of those men were still in the Wisconsin Synod, Mühlhäuser and Conrad. Meiss had gotten expelled a year late in 1851 for questionable behavior. Ployce joined a Reformed church in New York. Weinman took a call to Baltimore in 1853 and then died at sea in 1858. Rada left for Germany in 1855, never came back. The struggle was always often a lack of pastors. But yet, God's grace kept the synod going. Other pastors trickled into the synod. Men like Karl Goldammer, who came in 1851 and started some churches in the Manitowoc area. Johannes Bading came in 1853. We'll hear more about him in a minute. 1855, Philip Kaler arrived, and he sort of became the confessional conscience of the Wisconsin Synod. But this lack of pastors was just an ongoing challenge, and the need was so great. German immigrants were flooding into Wisconsin, this new state, and pushing into the frontier areas of the state. They were very much sheep without a shepherd. Many of the pastors who were coming over from the mission societies, unfortunately, some of them had questionable character, some of them didn't have a whole lot of doctrinal knowledge and integrity. An example of one of those would be this man, Ludwig Nietmann. For every Kaler and Bading, there was a Nietmann, a man whose name became an adjective in Wisconsin Synod circles for pastoral incompetence and meddling. You didn't want to be a Nietmannist. This guy was a piece of work. It seems he had spent some time and got in trouble with the law in Germany, spent some time in jail, came over with his family to Buffalo, actually had some contact with some old Lutherans there, but then he got arrested and convicted of being a Schweinedieb. I had to get one German word in there. A pig thief. Don't ask me. Later, actually, he got accused of stealing a Christmas tree from a cemetery. Well, it seems that he then moved to Milwaukee to maybe stay one step ahead of the law. And because he had some religious background and training, the folks at St. John's in town of Greenfield, today that's 68th and Forest Home in Milwaukee, they hired him to be a teacher in their school. When their pastor retired, they petitioned the synod to have Nietmann ordained and called to be their pastor. The synod, with some reluctance, agreed. About a year later, Nietmann accepted a call up to St. John's in Newtonburg near Manitowoc, and that's when his past caught up with him. In 1862, he had to write, sign, and read a letter to the Synod Convention, resigning his call from the congregation, resigning his call from the Synod, and promising to never again pass himself off as a Lutheran pastor. He didn't keep promise number 3, because he started worming his way into independent Lutheran congregations, first in the Oconomowoc area, and then he landed up at Emmanuel in Kewanee. The building on the left would have been the building that was the sanctuary when he was the pastor up there. And here his true colors came out. He tried to start his own synod. He was involved with Masonic rituals at Masonic lodges. He was preaching in Methodist and Baptist churches. He was meddling in area Wisconsin Synod churches. Finally, about 5-6 years later, Emmanuel Kewanee terminated his call. And the next pastor that came to fix things and get the Emmanuel Kewanee into the Wisconsin Synod was a man named August Pieper. Those of you who know a little history know that this guy was pretty good. He eventually was a seminary professor and president for some 40 years. Here's the amazing, surprising grace in this Nietmann story. Nietmann had a daughter, he had several children. One of his daughters, though, settled in the Kewanee area. She had a daughter, Lydia, who married a farmer named Otto Stiebs, or Steebs. That name might ring a bell with some. I know there's a lay delegate here from Emmanuel Kewanee who said he knows some of them are still there in Kewanee. Well, one of the daughters, Edna, married a 1934 seminary graduate by the name of Rudolf Otto, my grandparents. Another one, Arden, became a Wisconsin Synod pastor. Ralph was a carpenter, but 2 of his sons, Ralph Jr. and William, became Wisconsin Synod pastors. So from this incompetent, pig-thieving pastor has come numerous generations of Wisconsin Synod pastors, called workers, teachers, lay people, and congregations. In fact, the next generation has just started. Jacob Kieselhorst recently graduated from the seminary. He begins the next generation. What can you say to that other than this is God's surprising grace? Well, stories like the Neatman saga kind of help us see why when Johannes Badin was elected Synod president in 1860, he pushed to the top of the Synod agenda, we got to start our own seminary. We need a more reliable source of pastors. The whole apprentice idea, that just took too long. We sent one student, Johannes Heinrich Sieker, went to Gettysburg Seminary in Pennsylvania. He was the only one who did, though, because they weren't just spending a lot of time on German. Our pastors needed a lot of German. There were some doctrinal concerns, maybe, and there was a concern that if we send our boys to Pennsylvania, well, they really want to come back to the frontier areas of Wisconsin to be pastors. So he was the only one who did that. Badin, for 3 successive conventions, pushed the issue. I love this quote where he says, "We must dig a well in our country and our synod that will supply the workers." And so in 1863, the synod made the courageous decision, middle of Civil War, a month before the Battle of Gettysburg, to start our own seminary. And it had small beginnings. It was in this house in Watertown. Interestingly, though, the Lord in His grace supplied a qualified professor. Edward Moldenke had just recently arrived in the Synod as the Reiseprediger, the traveling preacher, sort of like a circuit rider who would go out, gather families that were, serve families with word and sacrament, try to gather them into congregations. He was a university-trained man. He had a doctorate in theology, so he was called to be the first professor, one student, who dropped out after a short time because of, it seems, academic incompetence, but he was quickly replaced by another guy. Small beginnings. The Synod recognized pretty quickly we need a feeder system, and so a college was started in Watertown, Northwestern, kind of a prep school college combination. And Badin, the president, was sent off to Germany and Russia to raise funds for the new school. It had its rocky beginnings. Moldenke resigned after 3 years when the Synod felt there needed to be a second theological professor, and Adolf Heinecke was called to do that. Moldenke thought that was a waste of resources, but again, God's surprising grace. Heinecke, also university trained, had a love for the Lutheran confessions and Lutheran theology and knew the Lutheran fathers. What a gift to our Synod. Ended up becoming the theologian of our church body. There were also times where there weren't enough students. The Missouri Synod sent a few students. There wasn't enough money sometimes, poor financial decisions. The farmers in the area provided food. There was also an identity crisis in the beginning. The first president of Northwestern, Adam Martin, he had been trained out among Eastern Lutherans. He had this vision to make Northwestern the Harvard of the West. But that wasn't what the Wisconsin Synod needed, and he departed after a few years. Beginning in 1871, however, the Lord provided 3 presidents of Northwestern that served from 1871 successively until 1987. That's just remarkable. Provided continuity, helped the Synod understand that Northwestern needed to be this school of the prophets. They were theologians themselves. Ernst, particularly, he saw the Synod through the college through a difficult time when in the summer of 1894, the original building was struck by lightning and burned. Thankfully, students were on summer vacation. No one was hurt. But some thought this would be the demise of the college and maybe even the demise of the Synod. But God's people came through, and within 9 months or so, this building was constructed so that the college could keep going. Northwestern and this seminary college prep school, this was really marked the beginning of our ministerial education system. And that system grew because of connections we had with neighbors. The Minnesota Synod, which had been founded in 1860, started its ministerial training school, kind of a prep school, college, seminary combination, in 1884, right here. 1884, Old Main, still on this campus. The Michigan Synod, also started in 1860, had started its ministerial school in 1885 in Manchester, Michigan, and it was moved to Saginaw in 1887. The three synods, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, in 1892 formed a federation. They retained their leadership, they retained their home mission work, but they said, we're going to work together on a few different areas. We're going to work together in publications, in foreign or heathen missions, and in ministerial education. So here was the plan. Northwestern becomes a prep school and college, pre-seminary college. Dr. Martin Luther College here in New Ulm becomes prep school and teacher training college, and the school in Saginaw becomes a prep school. They then, the Federation then, after their first Federation meeting, in fact, it was on this exact day, oh no, wrong one. That's a different one coming up, never mind. What they did was, though, 1893, they completed the building of a seminary in Wauwatosa. Does that sound familiar? Prep schools, colleges, seminary? Things were a little challenging in the beginning because the Michigan guys kind of liked their seminary in Michigan. They didn't want to give it up right away, and so there was a little controversy for a few years, but by 1910, things were running smoothly. That system, over the years, changed and grew. Here's the date I wanted to mention. The seminary, they decided to build a new seminary in Mequon. It was on this exact day, July 22nd, 1928, that they had the cornerstone laying ceremony for the seminary in Mequon. That was completed in 1929. They started a new prep school, Northwestern Lutheran Academy, in Mobridge, South Dakota in 1928. That closed in 79, and at the same time, the prep school that was here in New Ulm relocated and formed Martin Luther Preparatory School on a campus, a Catholic school campus that we bought in 1979. And then, of course, in 1995, we have the amalgamation that occurs. Martin Luther Preparatory School and Northwestern Prep School amalgamate to form Lutheran Prep School in Watertown, and the two colleges amalgamate to form Martin Luther College here in New Ulm. This ministerial education system, members of the Synod have supported it all these decades with financial support for building projects and financial assistance to students, with hours and hours of volunteer work and prayer, and most importantly, with their sons and daughters. This is a real jewel of our Synod, a truly unique blessing where a lot of church bodies who've had that kind of a system in the past, that system has disintegrated, but God in His surprising grace has preserved it for us so that we have consistently had a supply of consistently trained pastors and teachers and staff ministers to serve God's people. The faculty, the staff, the students, these schools, gifts of God's surprising grace. Besides a shortage of workers, and that's really been one that's gone on and off throughout our Synod's history, we're of course dealing with that again today, another issue was financial support in the early days. God in His surprising grace provided some benefactors. One was the German mission societies. They especially supported the Reiseprediger program. The two men there pictured, Gottlieb Fachtmann and Edward Moldenke, were two of those Reisepredigers, traveling around areas of Wisconsin. Eventually Moldenke did this also Fachtmann did this also in Germany, or in Minnesota. A lot of congregations in the Wisconsin Synod still today can trace their beginnings to work that these two men did. Muehlhäuser had connections back east, and this led to support from the oldest and at the time largest Lutheran church body, the Pennsylvania Synod. Pennsylvania almost really became our mother. And we in the Minnesota Synod were the Western daughters. Routinely, they would send money to our president, to the Synod presidents, who would then distribute it to pastors who were in need. Professor Tim Grunmeyer of MLC recently wrote an article detailing this connection to Pennsylvania. But with this financial support came some doctrinal entanglements. The German mission societies, who were in that union church situation over in Germany that President Schrader described, they wanted the synods in America to have that same kind of tolerance of the differences between Reformed and Lutheran. The Missouri Synod in particular, in their publication Der Lutheraner, started criticizing that, calling the Wisconsin Synod un-Lutheran, saying that we had a paper confession. That was regular, those criticisms were there regularly for a number of years into the 1860s. The Pennsylvania Synod helped us a little bit become a little more confessional, because the Pennsylvania Synod was a little more confessional. They criticized theologians like Samuel Simon Schmucker and other Lutheran theologians in the East who were trying to Americanize Lutheranism, trying to diminish the distinctions of Lutheranism, like the real presence of the Lord's Supper and infant baptism and teachings about the end times. In fact, Schmucker even wanted to Americanize the Augsburg Confession. Well, Pennsylvania Synod and other synods, including the Wisconsin Synod, rejected this idea. But the Pennsylvania Synod, under the direction of Charles Porterfield Krauth, went even a step further. They started a rival seminary to Gettysburg in Philadelphia in 1864, and in 1867, Krauth led the beginning of a new grouping of Lutheran synods called the General Council. Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan synods were all charter members of this group, and it was meant to be more confessional. Meanwhile, in the Wisconsin Synod, there were internal developments that were leading to a turn to the right, a more confessional Lutheran position. Boding himself had come to Wisconsin with a greater appreciation for the confessions, thanks to his training at the Hermannsburg Mission House back in Germany. Philip Kahler had come. Again, greater appreciation for the Lutheran confessions. Gottlieb Reim was the first convention essayist in 1861 whose essay talked about the value and importance of the Lutheran confessions. Reim, Boding, Kahler, and another pastor, E.E. Sauer, formed the Northwestern Conference, which was a leavening effect on the rest of the synod, leading the synod slowly toward a more confessional position. In fact, that name Northwestern in our synod's history, Northwestern Publishing House, Northwestern College, it's really paying homage to that old Northwestern Conference. And then Heinecke himself, he's kind of the last piece of the puzzle. Now we've got our gifted, committed theologian. Things kind of came to a head at the 1868 Synod Convention. Already in 67, as President Schrader said, we started expressing concerns about the connection with the mission societies. Well, in 1868, the decision had to be made. Mühlhäuser had died a year earlier. Boding paid respect to him and then said, on the one hand, we openly accepted all the confessional writings of the Lutheran Church, a fact which the Synod pronounced virtually every year. Yet on the other hand, we consider the relationship with the societies which are incorporated with the United Church and the Union to be something proper. The vacillations must have an end. And sure enough, they did have an end at the 1868 convention. God, in his surprising grace, led the Synod to walk away from money, the support from those societies, and a sizable amount that Boding had raised that was in escrow, kind of an endowment fund back in Germany. We lost that money. That was support for the college. And we lost some men over this too. But we'll get to that in a second. The other issue at the same convention was the General Council. Questions arose over end times teaching. Some were advocating for the false teaching of millennialism. The proper practice of church fellowship. Some were fine with Reformed pastors preaching in Lutheran churches. And membership in lodges. Some were allowing members to belong to non-Christian lodges such as the Masons. Now the Synod had high hopes for this General Council. This could have been a supply of students maybe for the schools. It was Pennsylvania Synod was giving us money. But at that 1868 convention, the Synod said, if we don't receive adequate answers, we're out. We didn't receive adequate answers. We withdrew. Later, the Minnesota Synod withdrew in 1871. Michigan Synod withdrew in 1888. Every other synod in that General Council, which included a number of synods in the eastern part of the United States, every one of them is now part of the ELCA. God, in his surprising grace, spared us. Even though it cost us some men. We lost Adam Martin, the president of Northwestern. But we gained some guys. We gained August Ernst. And we gained Friedrich Notz, who spent 3 decades teaching Hebrew at Northwestern. And the guy on the right, Reinhold Adelberg, who served as pastor in Watertown and later at St. Peter's in Milwaukee and was sort of the adjunct English professor at the seminary for a number of years. Now, of course, we had to go look for some friends. Don't want to be alone. We looked west. One option was the Iowa Synod. The Iowa Synod even sent a contingent to some of our synod conventions, including the Fritschel brothers, who were their theologians at their seminary. But the Iowa Synod had some doctrinal concerns that we weren't quite comfortable with. Minnesota Synod, we began some connections with them, thanks to their new president, Seeker, the guy who got trained at Gettysburg. He was their synod president, and by early 1870s, we were in fellowship with the Minnesota Synod. Maybe the most remarkable one, though, was that the Synod Convention directed Boding to go talk to those old Lutherans, Walther, CFW Walther, and the Missouri Synod. This was remarkable because only as recent as that spring, the Missouri Synod was still criticizing the Wisconsin Synod. The fall of 1868, Walther and some leaders of the Missouri Synod got together with Boding and Haneke and others in the Wisconsin Synod. Doctrinal discussions revealed that there was full unity of faith. President Walther, previously the stern critic, was overjoyed. He included in his November 1st Lutheraner report the declaration, "All our reservations about Wisconsin have been put to shame." My goodness, after these first 18 years of our synod, often receiving criticism, but now the Lord in his mercy and grace had worked among our synod to turn us to the right to a more confessional position, and so began almost a century of a treasured fellowship with the Missouri Synod. It also opened the door, and this was, by the way, full doctrinal agreement in the public confession of faith of these two church bodies. Just a truly remarkable thing. It also opened the door for the Wisconsin Synod to be a charter member of the Evangelical Lutheran Synodical Conference of North America. This Synodical Conference was a grouping of church bodies, the largest grouping and most confessional grouping of Lutheran church bodies in America. The founding convention was held in 1872 in July at Bodin's Church, St. John's in Milwaukee. At the opening service, Walther preached, "O blessed, happy day. Our children and children's children will speak of it and rejoice." Sure enough, it's still happening today. We still speak of it. My grandfather, Armin Schutze, wrote a history of the Synodical Conference, and he described the conference this way: the Orthodox Synodical Conference and its synods were above all to be a mission-minded conference and mission-minded synods. Doctrinal integrity and mission work must go hand in hand. The Synodical Conference is all about Christ for us and Christ through us. That turn to the right had happened now for the Wisconsin Synod. We were a more confessional church body, entirely by God's grace, working through his word among us. That Synodical Conference unity was challenged almost right away. A controversy broke out in the Synodical Conference led by theologians of the Ohio Synod and Norwegian Synod who were saying that God's election of people was in view of the faith they would someday have. Basically what this meant was that there was something in the human being that God saw, and that's why he chose them. So it's not his grace, it's something in us. It opened the door for a minimizing of God's grace and an addition of human effort into salvation. Again, by God's surprising grace, the Wisconsin Synod stood with the Missouri Synod. Haneke stood with Walther. The Ohio Synod and the Norwegian Synod both withdrew from the Synodical Conference. And today, the vast majority of those Ohio Synod congregations and the vast majority of the Norwegian Synod congregations, with the exception of our brothers and sisters in the ELS, are now all part of the ELCA. God, in his surprising grace, once again spared us. Those founding pastors, those early pastors of the Wisconsin Synod, had a passion for mission work. When they arrived in Wisconsin, most of that work was the hard work of gathering immigrants into congregations and trying to get people who just were trying to live day to day. They were so busy clearing the land and planting and whatever else went into trying to establish a life in this new place, often in frontier places. And it was often among people who were kind of more nominal Christians back in Germany, and now they arrive in America, and you're trying to find them, you're trying to reach them, you're trying to bring them into congregations and get them involved. But again, God's surprising grace at work. Over those years, steady growth occurred in our synod. But that mission zeal, that mission spirit in the hearts of those early pastors, most of whom had been trained at mission houses, often with the dream of going to places like India and Africa and bringing the gospel to people that didn't look like them, that still existed in their hearts. And so they had this desire to take the gospel to the heathen, as they called them, people who weren't like them. Some of that support occurred through the Synodical Conference, which in the late 1870s began doing mission work among the recently freed African American slaves in the South. But the Wisconsin Synod leaders wanted a more direct mission. And finally, with the Federation in 1892, they decided to take that step, and they sent 2 seminary graduates in the fall of 1893 to the Apache reservations in Arizona, Johannes Plucker and George Adishek. Honestly, we did not send them out with a whole lot of support. No language training. They didn't really even know English that well. In fact, Adishek was so poor at English, he only lasted a year and came back to Wisconsin. No missiology training. How are we going to start? Where do we start? I don't know. No house. They had to live in glorified tents for a while. Different climate. And the Apache, who were somewhat suspicious of white people. But God, in his surprising grace, through perseverance and patience and work, eventually a start occurred. And it was in the next century, the 20th century, that things started to take off. 1906 saw the arrival of Gustav Harders. He had been a pastor in Milwaukee, but he had some health ailments, and his doctor said, you know, a change in climate would do you good. Get out of the winter and humidity of Wisconsin and the Midwest, go down to the high desert of Arizona. He spent the rest of his life until 1917, when he died, serving on the Apache reservation, supervising, organizing, providing some structure to the work, publicizing it among the synod through 3 novels he wrote, German novels, based on, kind of set on the Apache reservations. In 1911, seminary graduate and newlyweds, Edgar and Minnie Ginther, arrived on the Apache reservations. They spent the rest of their lives there. Edgar, as well as their son Arthur, also spent his entire ministry on the Apache reservations. Edgar was known as the tall missionary. He would go out and make camp visits to Apache, especially when they were having health problems. He would bring some medicine for their physical needs. Most importantly, he brought the gospel for their spiritual needs. Wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, making desks for the school. Part of the building project that took place, Open Bible in White River. I don't know, is this the first Builders for Christ project, I guess, maybe? He and Minnie in the early 1920s founded a nursery or orphanage on the reservations at East Fork. In fact, Minnie's brother and sister-in-law came out from Wisconsin, came down to Arizona to help work in the nursery. Here's where I'd like to interject another family story. That seminary student, Rudolph Otto, when he graduated in 1934, there were no calls. Almost all the seminary graduates, hardly any of them received assignments. There just weren't any, no money. But Minnie Ginther was his aunt. And she and Uncle Edgar said, come on down to the reservation. We'll put you to work. You can live with us. You won't cost the synod a dime. And so he did. Went down there, started working in White River. Meanwhile, back in Kewanee, Edna Stibbs had the dream of taking care of babies who did not look like her. She got some deaconess nursing training and went down to the East Fork nursery. And pretty soon, young, dashing Pastor Otto was making trips over to the East Fork nursery to take out on dates Edna, and well, the rest is history.